So there's a whole bunch of challenges that teachers describe when they jump into this work. Probably one of the most obvious ones, which comes up with any new initiative, is time. How do teachers, in your experience, describe the challenges of time, and then how do they sort of work around some of those challenges?
I think there's two elements to the time challenge. One is time in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
How do I fit this into what I'm already doing? Where is there room? And so one of our goals as a coach is to help teachers identify how to embed it into the lessons they already do, and to recognize all of the things that are already a part of the process.
Yep, that they're already doing.
They're already doing a lot of it. So that's one concern with time. And two, the other concern is planning, because the design thinking process requires a decent amount of preparation, and I think that's where most of the teacher's work actually comes in. Once the project starts, it's much more project management, but developing the content, collaborating with others would be another concern, especially if we're doing an interdisciplinary project. And for the higher grade levels, how do we find common planning time is another huge topic that comes up in a lot of conversations.
And it's, I think the other challenge that shows up is that it's almost impossible to get more of those time resources from institutions until you've demonstrated some success with the effort. So in a lot of schools, these kinds of things start in the periphery of schools. They start in robotics clubs and engineering clubs, in sort of weird parts of the year, at the very, very end of the year, in the weird middle time between Thanksgiving and Christmas, a couple of those kinds of things, or other kinds of lunch hour segments, or other kinds of things where people can wander into the makerspace over lunch. And then when there's some success in those informal times, is when it's easier to go back to the administration or go back to faculty colleagues and say, well, maybe we ought to be thinking about how do we restructure our schedule, or how do we make longer blocks of time, or pick certain days of the week where we schedule more time for these kinds of interdisciplinary, hands-on things that take a longer chunk of time to be able to happen. So another challenge that teachers probably run across quite a bit is with assessment. So these are pretty new kinds of practices that we're asking teachers and students to jump into. So what do those assessment challenges look like, and how do teachers respond to them?
I think design thinking is really a set of skills. And so we're still trying to figure out, how do you appropriately and effectively assess 21st century skills in a way that's really meaningful. And it's very different from our traditional assessment practices of evaluating content and memorization through multiple choice questions. That's just that doesn't really align with the design thinking process. And so assessment is definitely a concern. We are trying to develop formative assessment tools, really bringing in reflection at every stage, asking students, what did you learn, why is it important, and how will you use that piece of information in the next step that you do. So bringing in reflection throughout, having the capstone presentation, having students collect their work through a portfolio and focus on the progress, not just the final product that they make, is an important piece, but we're still trying to figure that assessment out and recognize that when we can show really quantitative evidence is when hopefully we can see more schools shift over and say, this is really important, we will make time for it.
Yeah. And as we've looked at sort of project-based learning over the last 10 or 20 years, and certainly it's been a lot longer than that, but it seems like one common pitfall in developing assessment tools, assessment rubrics, and things like that is that the design thinking process can be understood as having a series of steps. We try to describe it more as a cycle and interlocking cycles, but it has these sort of steps. And usually there are concrete things as a sort of minimum baseline that we want students to do. So we say, well, it's the discover phase, so we want you to interview at least 3 people. And a lot of the assessment rubrics end up being organized around those particular steps and essentially those sort of compliance checklists. Did you do these 2 things? Did you do these 3 things? Did you do these 4 things? And those, essentially capture students' ability to follow directions rather than capturing the ability. It's not just talking to 3 people, it's eliciting, information that they wouldn't have gotten that's going to shape the direction of their design, shape the direction of their problem finding if they hadn't done that kind of work. All of this involves a pretty big changing role for the teacher. So how are teachers sort of shifting from, people who deliver content to people who facilitate these kinds of more open-ended learning experiences?
Yeah. I think that the design thinking process dramatically shifts the role of the teacher in the classroom, because it is them setting up this experience and then allowing the students to really drive the process that they go through. And we encourage teachers to often do these projects in small teams, and what happens is each team is going to go in a different direction through the discovery phase. And so there is no one set answer. That's the reality of large, sticky, ill-structured problems. We don't know the solution, and so allowing students to have that flexibility is really empowering for students, but it becomes very challenging for teachers. It becomes challenging in knowing what I'm going to do every day with students, how I best support students, and back to that assessment piece, if each team is producing a different result, how do I compare them objectively in order to evaluate students on an even playing field?
Right. And my experience is that students have two different kinds of reactions to this work. There's a whole bunch of students who will say, wow, I totally love this. Here I'm being challenged. This is really exciting. This is the kind of stuff that I want to do. And there's a whole group of other students who say, whoa, wait a minute. Like, we had a contract here that like you would tell me exactly what I need to do and exactly what high quality performance looks like. And I'll be relatively quiet in class and do that for you. And in return, like I won't call my parents or I won't act out in class and things like that. And here you are asking me to solve problems on my own, and you tell me you don't even know what the solution of those things look like. And I think for students, especially for those who have gotten good at kind of doing school, being asked to do authentic problem solving, they can have a really strong negative reaction to. So they're, some students really gravitate towards this and think it's really great, but other students say, whoa, 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 like I'm supposed to know how to get an A here. What are you doing sort of unmooring all those expectations that we had before?
And I think especially some of those high-performing students and teachers who are used to having very successful classrooms who perform very well on assessments, this idea of the unknown, this idea of risk and potentially failure is really uncomfortable. And approaching design thinking from the mindset of we're going to explore, we don't know what's going to happen, we're going to learn no matter if this is successful or not, is a shift that we're asking teachers and students, their families, the entire school culture to take. And it's not an easy shift, and it takes some time for teachers to become comfortable with that.
And the hard part of that is we know increasingly from industry, we know from academic research here at places like MIT that failure is absolutely central to learning. If we're not trying things which might not work, then we're not possibly doing things which are sufficiently interesting. But at the same time, we've created this educational system where the expectation is every time you'll go out and do something, you'll do something right. And that's implicated in assessment, it's implicated in how we spend our time, it's implicated in all kinds of things. So developing that kind of tolerance of failure seems to be one other challenge, and yet some other sort of essential part of it. I mean, I think it's also why a bunch of these things get shifted off into the periphery. So we say, all right, the core of school is the place where you have to get a 98 or you have to get a B+, or we have to do assignments in this kind of way. But in the robotics class afternoon, which is only sort of for credit or as extracurricular or whatever, that's where we can really make the robot 100 times and have it be broken and not work 100 times before we end up fixing it. For teachers who get to sort of the other side of that, where things really start working and things start taking root, what do people get excited about? What are the sort of most enjoyable parts of engaging in this for educators?
I think educators have a lot of fun, and they feel like they're actually doing meaningful work that will prepare students for their future. They see lots of engagement. They see students that are curious, who are digging into topics that they may not have explored before, who are surpassing expectations. And that's really exciting to see students take genuine ownership of what they're learning. So I think that, for me, is one of the most powerful elements of the design thinking process, this student empowerment, giving them more ownership of their work, and really letting them shine in areas that are really interesting to them.
Well, that seems like a great place to end the conversation. But thanks for coming in and helping us think about these things in Unit 2 here.